The lights in the papal apartment never went off. Not at midnight, not at 2 in the morning, not at 3:30, when the streets below the Apostolic Palace were empty and the city had surrendered to the particular silence that Rome produces in the hours before it remembers itself. Anyone who looked up that night from the cobblestones of the piazza would have seen the same thing. A single lit window. And behind it, a man who was not sleeping. On the desk in front of him, a piece of paper. 12 pages, actually. Covered in his own handwriting, red ink crossing out line after line of the official text that the Secretariat of State had prepared with the careful, calibrated language that the Vatican had used for decades to speak about wars without naming them, to mourn deaths without assigning responsibility, to express sorrow in the precise vocabulary of a house that has learned to grieve without accusing. He was not using that vocabulary anymore. Beside the handwritten pages sat a list. 2 columns, names on the left, ages on the right. The list was not long. It did not need to be long to do what it was doing to him. He had read it 3 times already. He folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to carry, and slid it into the breast pocket of his cassock. Then, he said something to the empty room that nobody heard, but that would, by the following evening, be repeated on the front pages of newspapers in 40 countries. He said, "Tomorrow, I will not be silent." His secretary, Father Matteo Rinaldi, arrived before 5 with coffee that went untouched. Rinaldi had worked beside Robert Francis Prevost since before the conclave, since before the white smoke, since before the world understood that the quiet Augustinian from Chicago who had spent his formation years in Peru was about to become the most consequential figure in the Catholic Church in a generation. He had learned to read the quality of the Pope's silences the way a sailor reads the surface of water, not for what is visible, but for what is moving underneath. The silence that morning was not the silence of a man thinking. It was the silence of a man who had finished thinking, and was now carrying the weight of a decision already made. The official speech, prepared by the Secretariat with the input of 3 senior cardinals and the diplomatic consultation of multiple ambassadors, sat at the corner of the desk. It had not been touched. The pages Leo was working with were something else entirely. "Holy Father," Rinaldi said, carefully. Cardinal Borromeo's office called again. They want to confirm the text before the morning press briefing. Leo did not look up. "They will have my text when I deliver it." Rinaldi recognized the tone. He left the coffee and closed the door. By 5:30, the Secretariat of State was fully aware that something was wrong. Wrong in the specific way that things go wrong in the Vatican when a pope decides that the institution's preferred approach to a problem is no longer adequate to the problem. The word that was circulating through the corridors, passed in lowered voices between aides and monsignors who had not yet slept, was the word rewriting. Not editing, not refining. Rewriting. And in the institutional memory of the Holy See, where diplomatic language is understood as a form of structural integrity, that word carried the weight of a crack appearing in a load-bearing wall. Cardinal Alessandro Borromeo, the Secretary of State, arrived at the Apostolic Palace before 6. He came without his usual entourage. He had been in Vatican service for 32 years and had navigated every form of institutional crisis that the Church's diplomatic apparatus could produce. He knew how to manage popes who pushed too hard in one direction and popes who retreated too quickly in another. He had helped construct the careful equilibrium that had allowed the Holy See to maintain dialogue with governments across the full spectrum of the world's political arrangements. He had never managed a pope who looked at that equilibrium and found it morally insufficient. The door to the study opened. Leo was standing. "Alessandro," he said. "Sit down." Borromeo sat. Leo did not. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the cardinal, looking out at a Rome that was only beginning to lighten at its edges. "Tell me the number," Leo said. The cardinal waited a moment. "From the strike 2 nights ago?" "Yes." 61 confirmed dead. Majority in the residential block. Several children. Leo nodded slowly. He did not turn from the window. "And what has this office said about it?" 2 statements, both calling for restraint on all sides and urging a return to negotiations. Leo turned. His face was the face of a man who has passed through anger and arrived somewhere on the other side of it, somewhere quieter and more resolute. "Alessandro," he said, I have been signing condolence letters for 3 weeks. Letters addressed to families in languages I do not speak, expressing sorrow in sentences so carefully balanced that they say nothing to anyone. He picked up the 12 pages. This speech will say something. Borromeo's eyes moved over the pages in the Pope's hands. He had seen a summary. He knew what was in them. He knew what the word aggressors meant when it appeared in a papal address. He knew what the phrase "those who fund the killing" meant when it was spoken from an altar with 30 cameras pointed at the ambo and representatives of more than 100 governments sitting in the nave. "Holiness," he said, "if you use this language, you will lose the American bishops by the end of the week. They were never mine to lose in the way you mean." The diplomatic mission to Washington. "The diplomatic mission to Washington," Leo said quietly, "is not worth the silence you are asking me to maintain." Borromeo looked at him for a long moment. He had disagreed with this pope before. He had managed those disagreements through the patient application of institutional process, through the accumulation of meetings and consultations and the gradual softening of positions over time. That process required the other party to believe that the institution's stability was worth the compromise. He understood now, looking at the man standing by the window with red ink on his hands, that this particular disagreement was not going to be managed. He rose. He bowed. He said he would inform the relevant offices that the address had been revised. Then he left, because there was nothing else to say. What neither of them knew yet was that the text had already leaked. Not the final version. 2 pages of an earlier draft, photographed on a phone by a junior official several floors below the Secretariat, forwarded to a contact, forwarded again to the inbox of a political commentary website in Washington. The pages were on the internet by 6 in the morning, Rome time. A White House advisor received a briefing on their content at 7:15. By 8, the response was already public. It arrived in 3 posts, short, vicious, deliberately personal. The first called the Pope weak on the issues that mattered to serious people. The second told him to manage his own institution before lecturing others. The third was an image, a digitally altered photograph showing the poster's own face, haloed, enthroned, dressed in white robes, designed to be humiliating in the specific way that a certain kind of public figure deploys humiliation when they feel challenged. Rinaldi saw the posts at 8:15. He carried the tablet down the corridor and set it, screen down, on a table outside the study. He would show the Pope, but not until he had finished the last paragraph. At 8:30, 3 cardinals requested urgent audiences. Leo granted one. Cardinal Ettore Palumbo was 82 years old. He had voted against Leo's election on every ballot of the conclave. He had spent the preceding months expressing his reservations about the American Pope's grasp of the Church's diplomatic tradition in the carefully indirect language that Vatican insiders use to say things clearly without being quoted. He was a traditionalist in the specific sense of a man who believed that the Church's longevity was inseparable from its willingness to manage its public positions with institutional patience. He walked into the study leaning on his cane and sat down without being invited, and said without any diplomatic preparation, "Robert, you are about to do the most dangerous thing you have ever done." Leo sat across from him. The 2 men looked at each other. "You think I'm making a mistake," Leo said. "I think," Palumbo said, "that you are confusing courage with recklessness. They feel the same from the inside. They do not look the same from the outside." "Tell me," Leo said, "when a child is killed by a weapon purchased with money donated by Catholics who sit in our pews on Sunday morning, is that a diplomatic matter or a moral one?" Palumbo did not hesitate. "It is both. It has always been both. That is precisely why the Church has always navigated this through private channels, through letters to heads of state, through conversations at the highest levels that do not create headlines and do not require governments to publicly respond to public challenges." Leo leaned forward. "And what did those private letters accomplish?" Palumbo said nothing. "My predecessor," Leo said, "was a holy man, genuinely holy. He whispered these truths into the ears of presidents and prime ministers. He wrote letters, he met with ambassadors, he agonized over the violence in every part of this world, and they smiled at him. They thanked him for the letter, they kissed his ring, and then they went back to the capitals where the decisions were made and they kept going." He paused. I will not be thanked for a letter and then ignored. Palumbo's hands tightened on the cane. You will be ignored anyway, he said. The only difference is that now they will ignore you publicly and loudly, and the church will absorb the consequences. Leo looked at him for a long time. Then he said something that Palumbo would repeat quietly, to one person, 3 months later. Perhaps the consequences are the point. The old cardinal stood. He walked to the door. He stopped. I have spent 60 years, he said, without turning around, protecting this institution from the kind of confrontation you are about to invite. I have done it quietly, at considerable personal cost, because I believed the Church's ability to remain at the table was worth the compromises that required. Leo said nothing. Palumbo turned. I still think you are wrong, he said. But I will be in the front row this morning. He left. The door closed softly, and a few minutes later, Rinaldi knocked and entered and turned the tablet so the Pope could see the 3 posts. Leo read them. All 3. Then the image. He looked up at Rinaldi. Print these, he said. Bring them to me at the Basilica, before I begin. Rinaldi understood. Yes, Holy Father. And then, before Rinaldi reached the door, the old direct line rang. The telephone installed in the papal study during the Cold War, connected to diplomatic channels that bypassed the normal switchboard, that had been silent for so long that several of the younger Vatican staff did not know its purpose. It rang. Leo crossed the room and lifted the receiver. He listened. He did not speak. For 30 seconds or more, he simply listened. The voice on the other end was audible in the room as urgency, then insistence, then something that moved toward threat. Then Leo said, in a voice so quiet that Rinaldi had to lean slightly forward to hear it, "Tell him that my address will be delivered as written. And tell him that if he wishes to discuss the substance of it, he is welcome to come to Rome. I will be here." He set down the phone. Rinaldi waited. That was the vice president, Leo said. He asked for changes to the text. Rinaldi's face showed what he was too disciplined to say. Leo picked up the 12 pages. He looked at them once more. Then he walked to the sacristy to put on his vestments. While the assistants helped him dress, he asked for a pen, not for the address. He wrote something on a small white card in his own handwriting, 4 words and a name, and folded it once and slid it into the inner layer of the vestments, against his chest. Rinaldi saw the gesture. He had seen it before, at moments of private significance in the Pope's life. He did not ask about the card. But during the homily that followed, when the Pope paused between 2 sentences for a beat longer than the address required, Rinaldi watched his hand move briefly to that place on his chest. The Basilica was full in the particular way it is full for occasions when the world understands that something is about to be said, that the world is not entirely prepared to receive. More than 300 cardinals and bishops, diplomats from over 100 nations, the American ambassador in his 3rd row seat, 30 cameras broadcasting live across 4 continents. Leo walked to the ambo. He did not place the official text on it. He placed the 12 handwritten pages, and beside them, face up, the 3 printed posts from the morning. He looked out at the room. He began. My brothers and sisters, there is a habit in this institution, a habit of long standing, of speaking about human suffering in the language of weather. We speak of violence as though it arrives and passes of its own accord. We speak of death tolls as though the dying happened outside the chain of human decision. We issue appeals for calm on all sides as though all sides are equivalent, as though the hand holding the weapon and the body receiving it occupy the same moral position. He paused. That language ends today. Nothing moved in the Basilica, not a program, not a breath. I have been provided with this morning with a particular kind of commentary, he said, looking briefly at the printed pages beside his notes. From a head of state. A Christian head of state. A man who holds a Bible at rallies and speaks at prayer breakfasts and invokes the protection of God upon his nation's military campaigns. He has called me weak. He has suggested I concern myself with managing my own institution. He has circulated an image of himself as a figure of divine authority. He let that land. I will not name him. The world already knows who he is. What I will say is this: the cross is not available as a decoration for the architecture of power. The gospel does not provide theological cover for the incineration of residential neighborhoods. And the God of the scriptures this man claims to represent is not the God of the military briefing room. He is the God of the child pulled from the rubble. He is the God of the mother who could not find enough of her son to bury. A sound moved through the basilica. Not quite a gasp. Something below that. A collective intake. For months I have signed letters, he continued. Letters of condolence to families I do not know. Letters written in the careful vocabulary of institutional sorrow. Letters that managed to express grief without assigning blame. Letters that arrived at bereaved households with the seal of the Holy See and the spiritual weight of a form document. He paused. I will not write another one. I want to be specific about what I am saying. I am not speaking about war in the abstract. I am not issuing a general appeal for peace that can be quoted by all parties and used by none of them. I am speaking about specific weapons, specific funding, specific governments that manufacture the instruments of mass death and sell them to other governments that use them on apartment buildings. I am speaking about the Catholics who sit in our pews on Sunday and work in the industries that produce these things on Monday. He looked directly at the American ambassador. There is no holy bomb. There is no blessed missile. There is no air campaign that God has sanctioned or that the Church will sanctify. Anyone who tells you otherwise is engaged in the oldest and most dangerous corruption of religion that exists, the corruption of using the sacred to justify what the sacred exists to prevent. The ambassador rose from his seat. He did not bow. He walked down the central aisle and through the bronze door without looking back. The sound of his footsteps was audible in the silence he left behind him. Leo did not pause. I have been told that what I am saying today will cost this church its influence in the corridors where decisions are made, that governments will close doors, that donors will withdraw, that the carefully maintained access that allows the Holy See to speak quietly into powerful ears will be forfeited. He gripped the edges of the ambo. I want to be honest with you about what I think of that argument. An institution that purchases its access to power by moderating its moral clarity is not an institution with access to power. It is an institution that has been captured by it. The church I was called to lead was not built in the corridors of power. It was built in the catacombs, by people who understood that the only thing worth preserving was the truth, and that the truth, properly spoken, does not require the permission of the people it indicts. He reached into his vestment and for a moment his hand rested on that interior pocket. Then he continued, This morning I am going to do something this office rarely does. I am going to name someone. Not a government, not a policy, a person. The room went very still. Her name was Faraday. She was 9 years old. She lived in a city that her family had moved to twice in 6 months, following the path of the conflict away from the most dangerous zones and into what they believed was a safer neighborhood. She was killed 4 days ago in a strike on the building her family had moved into the previous week. Her mother told me, in a call last night, that Faraday had been afraid of loud sounds, that she had asked, on the morning of the day she died, whether God could hear prayers spoken underground. He stopped. The room absorbed it. That question, he said, should end this conversation about whether the church has a right to name names. Faraday's question is the only theological argument any of us need. If God can hear prayers from underground, then God can hear what we say at this ambo, and God will hold us accountable for whether we said the true thing or the comfortable thing. He looked out at the full room, at the cardinals and the diplomats and the cameras. I cannot stay quiet anymore. The 6 words fell into the basilica like stones into deep water. Cardinal Palumbo, in the front row, sat without moving. His hands were on his knees. His eyes were closed. What came after the homily happened at a pace that the Vatican's communications apparatus was not designed to manage. Within 90 minutes, the address was being broadcast in translation across 40 countries. By midday, 6 governments had issued responses. 3 were warm. 3 were furious. 1 recalled its ambassador. Another announced a formal review of its diplomatic relations with the Holy See. The American posts continued. 11 of them by afternoon, each one louder and more personal than the last. The vice president held a press conference in front of a flag and said the Pope had forfeited his moral authority to address the affairs of sovereign nations. Inside the Vatican, 3 senior cardinals issued distancing statements. 4 others responded to those statements with their own, taking the Pope's side with a directness that Vatican observers described as unprecedented. And in St. Peter's Square, something else was happening. People arrived without being organized, without a rally, without an announcement. They came because they had watched the address on their phones and had felt something shift in them. By 8 in the morning there were several hundred. By 10, several thousand. They were not holding political signs. They were holding paper, cards, pieces of torn notebooks. On each one, a name. The names of people killed in the conflicts the Pope had named. Names in Arabic and Ukrainian and Farsi and Tigrinya and Burmese. A wall of names accumulating in the square that had witnessed every significant moment in the modern history of the Church. When Leo looked out from the window of his apartment and saw them, he stood for a long time without speaking. Rinaldi stood beside him. "They came for the names," Rinaldi said quietly. Leo reached into his pocket and took out the small white card. He looked at it. He looked at the square. He looked at the card again. "Bring me a microphone," he said. "I'll speak from here. Now." He didn't prepare anything. He went to the window and raised one hand, and the noise of the square contracted into silence with a speed that no technician could have produced. "My friends," he said, "yesterday I told you I would not be silent. Today you have come to tell me you will not be silent either. So let us not be silent together." The square answered. Then it quieted again, because it understood there was more. "This church does not belong to the men who have called me weak this morning. It does not belong to any government or any flag or any political arrangement. It belongs to Faraday. It belongs to every name you are holding in your hands. And I am telling you from this window, in front of everything that can see and hear us, that I will not stop speaking until the naming of those names is no longer necessary." He paused. Truth is not available for negotiation. Peace is not an optional feature of the gospel. The men who are making war on children will face accountability. Perhaps not in this world. But when they face it in the next, this church will have been found standing with the victims. Not with the generals, not with the donors, not with the photograph, with the people who were in the building when it fell. The square did not cheer. It did something rarer. It was silent in the way that 10,000 people are silent when they have collectively decided to remember. Then, one by one, the names began to be read aloud. Different voices, different languages, different accents, each one carrying the weight of a specific life that had been reduced to a name on a piece of paper held by a stranger in a piazza in Rome. The names rose and moved through the air above the square and against the old stone walls of the basilica and through the open window where Leo stood. He did not move for 3 hours. That night, the call came from Tehran. A bishop had arranged it through channels that required every favor he had accumulated in 20 years of service. The woman on the line was Faraday's mother. She was crying when he answered. He let her speak without interrupting, through the translator, her words arriving to him in the particular broken rhythm of a person trying to give language to something that language was not built for. She told him about a yellow dress, about the sound of thunder and the fear it produced, about a question asked on a morning that turned out to be the last morning. When she stopped crying, he said, "Today your daughter stood at this altar with me. She does not know it, but she was there. And she will be there every day for the rest of my life." He said he was sorry he had not spoken sooner. The translator paused, then relayed her response. She said she was not asking him to be sorry. She was asking him to keep going. He told her he would. He hung up the phone and, for the first time in the day that had just passed, he wept. Not for long, but genuinely, in the specific way that grief comes when you have been holding it at functional distance and then finally allow it to arrive. Rinaldi heard it through the closed door. He sat down in the corridor and closed his eyes. By morning, the homily had been translated into 76 languages. The window video had been watched 400 million times. A Muslim cleric in Cairo had read from the text during Friday prayers. A rabbi in Jerusalem had distributed it to his congregation. Bishops' conferences in 14 countries had issued endorsements. 3 American senators had introduced legislation condemning the address. The president had gone silent for 6 hours, which his staff later described as unprecedented. In the Apostolic Palace, Leo placed the small white card on his nightstand. He did not put it away. He left it where the first light of morning would find it. The church Leo was breaking, an old cardinal had said in the darkest hour of the previous morning, was the church that had learned to stay quiet. The church he was saving was the one that would not. The names in the square were still there when the sun came up. People had left them overnight, pinned to the railings and the barriers and the stones, hundreds of pieces of paper moving slightly in the early breeze. The names of people who had asked questions from underground and deserved to be heard above it. He had promised a mother in Tehran that he would keep going. The square was waiting. He would. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And leave in the comments the name of anyone you want remembered. Every name matters. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.